Welcome to another episode of Aviator 90 from Angle of Attack. In the last episode, we discussed lift and why it is essential for flight. Now we will talk about the other three forces of flight. You may have remembered one of Sir Isaac Newton's laws that I mentioned, which is, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. With that said, I'll now teach you what I know about the other forces on the aircraft. Because last episode we talked about lift, I find it appropriate to talk about weight. Weight is the opposite of lift. Out of all the forces, I consider this to be the simplest of the forces of flight because it has a few key aspects that we are both familiar with. First, a plane is not lighter than air, therefore it'll fall without the lift component. Second, gravity. We all know what this is, and thank goodness for it. Otherwise, this whole flying thing just wouldn't mean anything to us, because everything would be off the ground all the time anyway. In all seriousness, gravity is obviously the biggest contributor to weight. You can see why it's opposite to the force of lift. Thrust can be described in general terms as the force that moves the aircraft forward. This force largely relies on Newton's third law, again, as you'll see. We'll be using a propeller in the aircraft we'll be flying in Aviator 90, so let's talk about how the propeller creates thrust. A propeller turns at a rate determined by the pilot as a result of engine power. The prop is at a pitch, or angle of attack, just like the wing we discussed in the lift section. The propeller essentially creates lift forward rather than up. This pulls the aircraft forward and also sends a blast of air back that assists a bit with airflow over the control surfaces. If an aircraft produces enough thrust to outperform drag, and we have a sufficient airfoil, the aircraft will fly. Drag is generally described as the forces upon the airplane that are pushing it back. These forces are basically friction, disruption, and resistance to airflow created by the forward thrust the aircraft is creating. Drag is broken up into several different types, which are friction, form, induced, and parasite drag. We'll now talk about each one of these. Friction drag is caused by the airflow around the airplane. As the air goes around the airplane, it comes in contact with the aircraft and creates friction as it touches. This in turn creates drag. Form drag is actually something we're all familiar with as it is very prevalent in car designs. It is basically how the shape of the aircraft interacts with the air flowing around it. Now, a sports car will be built in such a way that form drag is reduced. Smooth, sleek, and with the least resistance possible. Aircraft, as you can imagine, are built in the same way. You don't see a big Vanagon flying around now, do you? This would not work. Induced drag is created as a result of lift that is created by the wing. You may or may not be familiar with winglets present on some airliners. These winglets are in place partially to reduce this very kind of drag because spoiled air is formed at the tips, and these winglets reduce that spoiled air. Parasite drag is anything on the airplane that can produce drag such as rivets, antennas, pitot instruments, etc. Parasite drag can even be produced by an extremely dirty airplane or a little frost on the airplane, believe it or not. Let's look at a few different phases of aircraft operation and see how the forces relate to each other. Now, in straight and level flight, lift is equal to weight and thrust is equal to drag. When lift and weight are equal, you stay in the same place, right? When descending, weight is greater than lift. Why? Our gravity is getting the better part of us, pulling us down. Obviously, angle of attack would have something to do with this as well. When climbing, lift is greater than weight. Why? Because we are defying gravity and pushing through it. Again, angle of attack does have a play in this situation. When on the ground and not moving, weight is greater than lift, keeping our wheels planted, and thrust and drag equal 0. You may think that these forces of flight aren't critical to flight, but they are. Everything you do in the air is a result of the relationship between these forces. Absolutely everything. Give yourself a big pat on the back. We can now move on to more advanced things. Next, I'll teach you about control surfaces. Until next time, throttle on.